I'm 26 now, and living in Pennsylvania, but when I was growing up, I lived in Montpelier, Vermont. My summers were spent hiking mountains, swimming in lakes, and exploring expansive forests. I knew that my state had bears and rattlesnakes in its more secluded, mountainous regions, but I never imagined that there was anything more terrifying than those out there. When I was 19, my friend Emily and I went to Moss Glen Falls for a day of swimming and picnicking, and it gave us a nice change of scenery from campus. The waterfall is located in Stow, which is a remote town in Vermont that has a population of barely 4,000. Emily was from another state and had never really seen much of the area beyond our college campus, so I figured showing her some of Vermont's quaint locations was in order. The day was perfect. We had packed plenty of food, sunscreen, and towels, and since it was a weekday afternoon, there was no one else at the falls except for an elderly couple who left not long after we got there. We spread our towels out on a large rock by the falls and alternated between climbing up the waterfall edges to get to the swimming pools and relaxing in the late afternoon sun. It was peaceful, and it was the perfect break for a long day of homework and classes. As the day wore on, Emily wanted to explore some of the trails near the falls. I was familiar with a few of them, and I tried to keep her on those. What I didn't account for was that she would insist on exploring some of the more outlying trails, and that we would consequently get lost. We spent nearly an hour walking in circles, our arms and legs getting covered in mosquito bites, and our bathing suits drying uncomfortably onto our skin. We had the flashlights in our phones to give us a little light once the sun set, but they didn't do much to illuminate the dense undergrowth shrouding both sides of the trail. Finally, we came across a blackberry patch that we were pretty sure we had seen earlier, so by logical default, we started heading down the path closest to the bushes. Emily kept asking me if I heard twigs snapping behind us, and I brushed it off as a city girl being afraid of deer or rabbits. I didn't hear anything myself, so I figured she was feeling paranoid due to it being her first time lost in the woods. Then I heard it. The noise came from somewhere behind us, and it was too loud to be a small animal like a rabbit. I figured it was another person out walking, or maybe a herd of deer passing through. Stow has never been a populous town, and the locals could argue that there's more deer here than people. I ignored the uneasy feeling building in the pit of my stomach and kept walking, chalking it up to my friend's paranoia rubbing off on me, and I babbled senselessly about cute guys to keep Emily and I distracted. After about 10 minutes of walking back to the car, we finally came in sight of the trailhead. There was a large boulder where the plaque was on it, dedicated to a young woman who had been murdered at the falls back in 1991, and right beyond that was my car. As we neared the boulder, relief evident on Emily's face, a weird noise came from the woods behind us. It sounded almost like a cat, but it was distorted and static, like it was coming out of an old radio. My first instinct was the fact that the cat was wounded or in danger. I've always been an animal lover, and if there was a hurt cat, I wasn't about to leave it out there to become a coyote snack. I turned around, ignoring Emily begging me to just get in the car, and peered back into the trail. I gave Emily the keys and told her to get our towels, now that we knew where we were, and I promised I'd be back momentarily. If I didn't find the cat right away, I wasn't going to spend forever looking for it, but I couldn't just drive away either. With the loss of the second flashlight, the woods seemed to be a bit more eerie to me, and the darkness was nagging at my peripheral vision. I walked a little ways down the path as I called to the cat, hoping to locate it by its meow, but I didn't hear anything for several moments. I was about to give up when I heard a low, out-of-place laugh behind me. I spun around, my heart beating way too fast, but all I saw was a large buck. I remember muttering something stupid, sneaky deer, then I headed back to the trailhead. That was when the deer laughed again, and I froze. The harsh sound was completely unnatural. For those of you who do not know, deer don't make sounds like that. They just make grunts. They don't make any sort of laughter-like noises, and even if they did, it wouldn't have the same cadence as a human's laugh would. And as this deer, it had a human laugh. This situation was weird and unnerving, and I kept hoping that someone would pop their head out from around a tree and tell me it was a prank. That didn't happen though. The deer took a few steps towards me, and then that odd cat sound came from it. I almost literally threw my hands up in a nope gesture, and I just started walking away from it as quickly as I could. I was almost in sight of the end of the trail when I felt something snag my hair. I swatted it away, thinking it was a branch since there was a lot of low-hanging trees along the trail, but the sensation turned instantly. I reached up to tug my hair free, but it wouldn't come loose. I turned to face the offending tree, my heart thumping in shock. The deer was now on its hind legs. It had my hair caught in one of its antler points. The snarls from a day of swimming and hiking were entangled around its antler. All I could do was just stand there as I felt its cold breath on my face. It was not warm, and it was not hot, but icy cold breath reefed around me. I let out the most shrill scream I had ever heard myself make, and I violently yanked my hair off its antlers. I sprinted for my car, screaming the whole way for Emily to start it. I heard the engine turn when I neared the boulder, and she didn't hesitate to floor it as soon as I was in the car. The tears streaming down my face were enough motivation. She didn't question me until we were nearly 5 miles from Moss Glen. I told her about the weird noises and the deer getting up in my face. I told her it startled me and that on top of that, the stress of being lost was just enough to make me panic. She bought my explanation, agreeing that we were both super tired, and adding that my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I haven't returned to Stow since then, even though I have visited Vermont recently. I know there's probably some sort of rational explanation for what I saw and what I heard that night, but I haven't been able to find what that could be. Let me just say, I'm a sucker for the paranormal. I have tons of encounters with ghosts, poltergeists, monsters, etc. But this is one of the scariest. I have grandparents. I love them. My mom usually leaves me with them if she is gone for a few days. And one day this happened. I was at my grandparents' place and I was home alone. It was at least 8 p.m. I was sitting on my computer and doing homework. You know, all the stuff that teenagers do. I was going downstairs to get something to drink when I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not in my house, but outside. I was scared because I watched way too many scary stories tonight. But I didn't want to be a wuss and thought it most likely was my neighbor's dog or something, so I went back to doing homework. But what I saw in my window was no dog. It was all black and tall, really tall. At least 12 feet. Me, an 11-year-old boy, 36 kilograms and 5 feet, there was no way I could fight it. I stared at it for a minute, but it felt like it was an hour. Then it jumped out of the window to my backyard, and then I heard my grandfather's voice. Damas. That's my name in Lithuanian. He gives us the key to the door. We forgot it. I was scared but relieved. My grandparents came back, and I was safe. But then I remembered my grandparents locked my door. They did have the key and it was only 8 p.m. And they weren't supposed to be back until, well after 9. I took my GoPro with that stick thing you attach to it and I started filming. I regret the decision with all of my life. Whatever it was, took the camera and started pulling me down. I struggled and yanked the camera back. Then I heard the thing go back somewhere else, out of my yard. I was very thankful for God that I survived. I called the police and showed them the footage, and they kind of believed me, I think. They left a man with me until my grandparents returned. My grandparents returned and I showed them the footage, and they soon moved out. That place is now abandoned, and I miss that place. Sometimes I still go there, but I always bring some kind of protection. I learned about the paranormal and I think I encountered a Wendigo. My name is Paul. I live in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I have always believed in the paranormal and cryptids since I was a kid. I never experienced anything strange until recent years. For more backstory, I just turned 19. I'm a male, standing about 6'8" and weighing in at 260 pounds. So, I'm a fairly big guy, and nothing scares me really. What does scare me, though, are stories of skinwalkers and the Dogman. I have heard stories from my indigenous friends for a while now of a creature known as the Rougarou. I have heard of it before from documentaries, so I had an idea of what it was. I never doubted their stories. One time, I remember that it was stalking one of my friend's homes on their reservation. She was down the block from her house when she saw it, but I don't remember the details that well. She told me a long time ago. If you guys want, I'll have her write it down and I'll submit it to the channel. But my story begins about 3 years ago. So, when I was about 16, around the end of summer, I was at a friend's house. We were just hanging out and playing video games. We stayed up until about 1 or 2 in the morning, but I had to get home because I had to do things the next day. I rode my bike over to his house, so I had to get home using that. I live 30 minutes away, but to me on bike that's like 10 minutes if I ride the paths that I take home. It takes me down this really long street that's basically a straight shot to my house. To the left of me is a really big park. It's not lit at all, and on the right, there are houses. I've always felt like I was being watched in that area, especially near the park with no lights. It's always pitch black at night, even in the city. I always bike there by myself, and nothing ever happens, but this night was different. I could feel it. I felt like I was being stalked, so I started biking faster. My bike is a double disc, so it's not a slow bike by any means, and I swear to God I looked over at the park and saw what seemed to be a dog running at me, but it was much bigger than any dog I've ever seen in the area, so I started pedaling away. I started pedaling harder and harder, and I threw my bike's gear all the way up to 8 and went my fastest, never stopping. But I never heard it running beside me in the park, like it didn't want to be in the light. I got to the end of the street and turned onto the sidewalk that went under these train tracks. I looked behind me. It stopped under the tracks and stared at me as I biked away, but I got a good look at it, and my heart sank. It was now standing on its hind legs, and just standing there at the point that I see that this is no dog. It was bulging with muscles, and it had a human shape, but with a dog head and legs. Its arms were the scariest. They were long and had dagger-like claws. Its breathing was ragged from running along beside me for so long. The look it gave me was pure vile. It was a mix of hatred and hunger, like it hated my existence. Its fur was darkish yellow, maybe light brown. It looked like how dead grass looks, all withered and dying. I got home in about 2 minutes after that. I was cutting cars off and running lights on my bike. I never biked by there at night again. I'm too scared. I now know what is out there. I live in the prairie, and it camouflaged itself perfectly in the tall prairie grass. I never told anybody this. I'm mostly afraid because no one would believe me. But I think it was a dogman or maybe the Rougarou that my friends told me about. But after researching that, I found out that people's pets were disappearing from the area at the same time that I saw what I think was this dogman. My fiancé and I postponed our wedding in 1990. We were getting stressed and needed a vacation. We lived on the Big Island in Hawaii, so naturally, we went to the mainland. We did not have much money, so we rented a car, bought a tent, and decided to try to visit and camp in as many state and national parks in the western US as we could. We were driving in the middle of nowhere on our way to Yellowstone. It was a desert-like area we were driving through, and it was the end of September and very hot. We saw an old building from far away on the road and decided to take a break to explore it. As we approached the building, we could hear flies and something smelling really bad. We opened the door, and it was like a big open farm building. The walls and metal roof were splattered in blood. Everywhere we looked, there were bodies, parts of elks. I am from the islands, but my fiance was from Northern California and familiar with wildlife. He said they were elk bodies. They must have been there for at least a while, and there was like 50 or more of them in there. It was so strange. They looked like they were torn apart. Pieces of meat were flung and hung all over inside the building. I freaked out and started to cry. The smell and sights were overwhelming. My fiance said he couldn't understand it, because it was not like they were being processed for collecting meat or horns or anything. All the parts were still there, and he said it looked like they were torn apart, not cut with a knife. I had to go. I felt like I was in shock. My fiance refused to let me call the police. He said he did not want to get involved. He said it must be the work of crazy poachers. A few miles later, we entered Yellowstone National Park, where as usual, we chose an out-of-the-way campsite. We were on high alert, so as we had been listening to news stories on the radio about a female hiker camping in a remote part of the park alone, apparently she was torn apart by a grizzly bear. There were few details about the attack, and I'm still unable to find any written reports on the event anywhere online, which is weird, because we heard the news report over the radio for several days before getting to the park. We had a campsite with a bathroom nearby and a barbecue. There were very few people in the park, and no one camping near us. There were signs everywhere warning people to be careful with food stores because of the bears. We had a couple of beers and went to sleep in the tent. I often got hungry after dinner and decided to take a bag of pears into the tent, thinking that if I put it under my pillow, that no animals would smell it there. Remember, I'm from Hawaii, and we do not have wild animals there. There are no bears, skunks, possums, squirrels, chipmunks, armadillos, wolverines, elks, lions, or snakes. We do have deer and boar in the mountains introduced by European hunters like 100 years ago, though. I fell asleep, pears snugly under my pillow. I was awakened by an immense weight on my upper right side of my chest and my entire right arm and right side of my torso, down to my hip. My first thought was, bear, there's a bear on top of me wanting my pears. But as the second developed into minutes, and the minutes turned into hours, this immense weight not once ever moved, nor did it shift, or twitch, or even make a single sound. In the first second, I decided not to move or make any noise, and definitely not awaken my boyfriend, who was soundly sleeping to my left. I felt myself beginning to panic, thinking that it had to be a bear attracted by the smell of my pears. But as time dragged by, I realized that if this were a wild animal, and it was literally on top of me, inches away from the fruit that it would have pawed outside the tent to get to, or at least shifted, moved, or snorted. But, to me, I felt like the car was parked on the upper right half of my body. It was just being so still. It was so heavy and unmoving. What was the weirdest aspect, besides it being a massive, unmoving, totally silent something, is that it was warm. This flurry of thoughts and confusions literally dragged on for hours. I became so terrified and overwhelmed, I knew whatever was sitting, standing, or laying, or parked, or whatever next to me would not have been of this world. Once after all of those hours of trying not to breathe heavily, panicking, or even twitch a muscle, I passed out cold from sheer terror, and my mind and body just shut down. I totally understand now how or why when people see a cryptid or monster they faint and or lose bowel control. The big difference with me is that I could not see it, I could only feel it. And thinking it was a grizzly bear that could use its razor-like teeth and claws to easily get into that tent, it made it so much more confusing. When I awoke the next day, my fiance was already up. I told him what had happened, and I was completely freaked out. I checked the tent for any marks or signs of something on the fabric, but there was nothing. There were also no suspicious paw prints or footprints around the tent or campsite. Instead of listening to my story, my fiancé stopped me and he started getting on my case and scolding me for those pears. I was totally still freaked out and wanted to leave. My right arm and right side of my body were aching. That was not a dream, nor was it sleep paralysis. I have never been that terrified all my life. Never before or since that happened. I told the story to an experienced Sasquatch researcher. He said these types of tent antics are pretty common with juvenile Sasquatch. He said many researchers and witnesses believe that Sasquatch can actually see through the tent fabric somehow and enjoy harassing campers. So, my story isn't a typical story, and I'm not sure how to categorize it other than folklore or maybe cryptid. So a few years ago, me and my boyfriend broke up and he started dating a girl that in our small town was a self-proclaimed witch or lakuza. In Hispanic folklore, it's some sort of shapeshifter. She would hold parties that involved certain rituals and sacrifices. She had many cats that would die mysteriously. And if you know anything about cats, it's that they don't die easily. She had about 5 cats die within a year, just randomly with no real explanation. Anyway, I often have vivid dreams when I was younger. This time, I fell asleep on the couch and had a very vivid dream about this same girl. She had this evil expression on her face, and she had spoken to me. It felt like she was delivering a direct message. So when I woke up, I told my mom that I needed to talk to her, but I didn't want to speak about it in front of my dad or boyfriend, since they would disregard the supernatural. We drove to a gas station a few miles down the road from our subdivision, and I explained the dream. We spoke about it for maybe 20 minutes before returning to our house. On the way back, on the street before mine, I saw a dark figure on the side of the road. I leaned in, focusing on it since it caught my attention. Now, most times I disregard it as just a person walking, but this time, it was different. It was like something was forcing me to notice. It was maybe 2 feet tall, and suddenly turned to face me. When it did, I realized it was an owl. But it was too large to be an owl, and the face was more like a woman's. It had pale skin, its eyes were human-like, but there were no color or white to them. It had a hooked beak like a bird. This thing's eyes were pitch black and it pierced right through me. It freaked me the fuck out. I was instantly filled with dread and overwhelming fear. I began panicking and asking if my mom had seen it too. She said no. She stopped the car and reversed. I looked back in the meantime, but I didn't see it anymore. My heart dropped in my stomach when I didn't see it. I would have felt better knowing where it had gone. It all happened in slow motion for me, but in reality it took all of 10 seconds to pass by. We sat there for a few minutes as I explained what I saw, but my mom said she never saw it. She explained to me what it was exactly and how her dad, my grandpa, had showed her one and her siblings when they were kids. They fly around and whistle like a human would, and if you whistle back, you're answering it and it'll come after you. I wish I could say that's all that happened, but it wasn't. Later that night at around 11 or so, me and my boyfriend were watching a movie when we heard a loud thud on the roof. We looked at each other like what the fuck. He muted the TV and we listened for a few seconds, and we could hear something moving around. It sounded like scratching noises or scraping against the roof. I began crying and telling him what happened earlier. I hadn't told him because I thought he'd think I was imagining things. Him being a skeptic of the supernatural. He got up because our room was at the front of the house. He exited our room and walked past our foyer and out the front door. He backed into the driveway and looked up on the roof, but said whatever it was gone by now. We never figured it out. It was very strange and a creepy occurrence. It still haunts me to this very day. I don't tell this very often, as it makes me look like a nutcase. Well, my name is Ross and I'm from the UK. Years ago, I used to work in a Blockbuster video store, so that gives you an approximate date as they don't exist anymore. Well, it was a Wednesday morning. I know that because deliveries were always on Wednesdays, and there had been a massive delivery. The store wasn't large, so the whole place looked like a child's giant box fort. There was only me and another girl in the store. Let's call her Claire, as I don't think she'd like me using her real name. She went out back to pack some of the delivery. I was behind the counter unpacking games and getting them processed for rentals. I had been kneeling down for about a half hour sorting discs when I looked up to see something on the counter. There was what I could only describe as a goblet. It was about 3 feet high and hard to see or explain. What I mean is, you know when you are laying on the grass on a sunny day and someone comes and stands with the sun behind you to talk to you and they are in darkness fringed by light? Well, it was like that. From what I could see, it was long, thin, and red, with small wings and tiny pinch-nose glasses. It was writing in a little book whilst looking at me. It looked like one of the goblins from Labyrinth crossed with one of the devils from Jim Henson's The Storyteller. My heart jumped into my throat. I nearly threw up and felt like passing out. My pulse was so high, my head was about to explode. It calmly put its pencil down, and at the side of its notebook, looked over its glasses at me, winked, and disappeared. Seconds later, Claire came out of the back office. She looked at me and said, "Do you feel alright? You look pale and like you've seen a ghost." I muttered I was fine and made some excuse to go into the back office. There I sat drinking coffee for about an hour till my hands stopped shaking. No one has ever believed me about this. They just look at me like I'm insane and move on. One thing that's always bothered me though, what was it writing in that book? I live in the suburbs of Budapest, Hungary, in a small town about 15 minutes from the city. They call it a town, but really it's just an overgrown village. It has the feeling to it and all. Lighting at night is scarce, but, and this might be a source of my luck here, our street is pretty well lit. Why I think it's lucky? A few days ago, I had to move out of my room to take refuge in a guest bedroom, so my room can get repainted. The guest bedroom is small, almost claustrophobic, and it has one large window, through which I can see most of the neighbors' houses on the other side of the street. Our flat is on the first floor of the building, a nice 2-flat house with a big garden, though it's mostly empty. My room's windows look directly into the garden, but the guest bedroom faces the street, which enabled my experience. One night, I was trying to sleep despite my insomnia. I started hearing strange pulsing sounds, like someone turned on loud music at one of our neighbors. But this sound was weird. It followed no particular pattern or beat, and yet it felt strangely familiar. It wasn't until I realized that it was getting louder and moving closer that it was the noise of something big walking down the street on 2 legs. Out of curiosity, I was already at my window, bathing in the lamplight coming from outside, when I spotted it. The creature was vaguely humanoid with smooth, gray skin, a head devoid of any facial features or any hair, and 4 arms. The second pair sprouting from the sides of its ribcage. It didn't look emaciated, but I could still see its bones beneath the skin. In fact, it looked oddly muscular, as if posing while strolling down the street. I forgot to tell this most important bit. This thing was huge. We live on the first floor, and I was looking upwards from my bed through my window, but I still had to go closer to the window to look at its head. This thing was at least 20 feet tall, possibly bigger, and there it was walking down our street in the middle of the night, calmly, looking around with an eyeless face, stopping occasionally to take a peek inside of a house, then continuing its stroll. I wasn't scared at first. My reaction was closer to, what the actual fuck? But that quickly turned into fear as it turned my way, its featureless face staring in my general direction. Realizing I was still in the lamplight, I quickly retreated and watched from the shadows. The giant walked to our house and took a good look. It stood there for at least a few minutes, seemingly scanning the house for something. I dared not move, lest it notice me, and God knows what it would have done to me. So I just stared, terrified, at this monstrosity, its 4 arms dangling idly beside it as it looked at me with this featureless face. Sorry for repeating it so much, but I stared at it for so long the picture is burned into my retinas, and when I closed my eyes, I could still see that face staring into my soul. Since I was young, I've seen these weird humanoid figures. They're black silhouettes, pitch black, looking and ranging from various tall sizes. Sometimes I can see them, but I can sense their location, and I get a fuzzy visual in my mind of how they look. For some reason, I've had one follow me for most of my life, but this particular one doesn't seem to like showing itself physically to me. I only get the sensation it's around or get small glimpses of it out of the corner of my eyes. I'm not sure why it's following me, but all these weird things started happening when I moved to the Bakersfield for a couple of years when I was a child. At first, I thought the places I lived were haunted. I don't think every house I've ever moved could be haunted though, so I concluded that maybe I'm being haunted. It doesn't matter where I move, this thing follows me. I can be in the middle of a conversation and I'll get that feeling that it's behind me watching me. I can sense this tall figure looming behind me when I walk from my home to school, or go to the mall with friends. Sometimes it'll leave for long periods of time, but eventually it returns. I don't feel threatened by it, but I don't feel comfortable around it either. I get the feeling it's waiting for something, and that makes me uncomfortable. I also don't get the feeling that it's human, or maybe it never was human. I've told my family about it and they don't really believe me. The only one that does is my cousin, who came to stay with me at my house for a little while. Really weird stuff happened when they came, and it continued to intensify until she left. I asked her about it and she told me she had noticed too, and it was weird because nothing like that had happened before at her place. Now I rarely see the silhouette creatures, but I still sometimes feel them around. I've hopefully gone away forever, but I'm still scared that they'll come back. Does anyone have anything similar happen? Could this be some sort of haunting, or is it some sort of cryptid creature? I'm not sure why this is happening, but any advice would be very appreciated. I suppose I should start off with some background. All of this may or may not be relevant. I'm still just trying to figure this out by giving out as much information as I can. So here it is. My friend Julia was found dead 2 years ago in a Walgreens parking lot. She was slumped over in her car with no visible injuries, and the case was ruled as a suicide by drug overdose. I never believed this. She was the kind of person that you see and you just cannot help from smiling. She was a joy to be around. She would never have done drugs, and she definitely would not do them to the point of an OD. I always thought the police were trying to cover up something. I just never knew what. I was never shown any evidence of medication in her car, and when I arrived at the scene, at her death, the officers never let me close enough to see anything. I never thought I would see her again, because typically dead people are supposed to, stay dead. I used to think that every day. I was taking a walk through a wooded area near my property earlier this morning. I would say it was about 8 a.m., and everything was normal, until the birds stopped chirping. Squirrels stopped jumping from tree to tree. The wind itself seemed to stop blowing. I was in awe. I had never experienced this kind of silence. The only sound was my breathing. I looked around. When I turned back, I was face to face at the path in the front of me. I saw a fox in the trail. It looked at me and tilted its head. I blinked and the fox was gone, or it transformed or something. Julia was standing about 15 meters down the trail from me now. And I was just mind blown. She was staring at me and smiled. She was in the same clothes as she was when I last saw her alive. A white blouse and blue jeans. This could not have been anyone else but her. the brunette hair, the facial features. It was her. I yelled out her name in disbelief, and she waved. I ran towards her, but she ran through the bush and out of sight. I went through the bush, and it felt like miles after I was following her, through thorns, still calling for her. I nearly fell when I reached a steep cliff that was about 30 meters into the small valley. I saw nothing but the sounds of the forest, and they came back to life. I just stood there on the edge of the cliff, trying not to fall off. I still have no idea what happened. Is Julia trying to tell me something? Does she need help? Was Julia the fox? I do live near some Navajo reservations, and some people have suggested that it might be a skinwalker trying to lure me to coming off that cliff. Please, if anyone has any answers to this, I would love to know if you think this is a skinwalker or some ghost or spirit. This is central Wisconsin, when my dad was around, not even a teenager yet. Wisconsin was even more rural back then, and the area has since become more city. Anyway, my dad and his friend grew up in the country, and always walked the woods, trails, and swamping land. Not much else to do, but my dad said that him and his friend were walking on a path in one of these spots one day, and this black cat kept following them. Anytime they stopped to look at the cat, the stop would look at them. He said they would try using stones and etc., but the cat just wouldn't get scared. And after a few minutes, they started walking faster and the cat kept following at a good pace. Apparently, they both got a very bad feeling and said they didn't want to look back anymore. Once they said that and started walking again, they heard this dark, evil laughter and turned around to see a man in a super old school, all black attire walking away laughing into the bush. So they freaked out, obviously, and ran away. So, this part was something my dad told me last year and I did not know until recently. My grandpa was friends with this older guy who lived around the area, and I guess my dad knew him and would stop by. After this cat thing, my dad came by one time and started telling the story. Apparently, it freaked the guy out real bad. He said he had been outside doing whatever, and all of a sudden, this pure black dog comes by and starts staring him down, then growling, and the guy had a super uneasy feeling and started backing up to his door. Apparently, the moment he turned his back and rushed in and slammed the door, the dog had changed and lunged towards the door, barking and crazy for a second before it went away. The guy said that he heard this evil laughter and looked out the window to see the same guy my dad saw, all black, old-school clothes from the 1800s, walking away laughing and disappeared. My dad swears to this day he didn't make it up and does not tell anyone. He hates me ever sharing it because this shit is so unbelievable that it makes people think that he is dishonest and crazy. I have no idea what it really was, but I can definitely say that it was some creepy shit.